today evening. He'll be giving us the concluding remarks. So if you guys have some questions, you can, put it on the chat box. We can, even ask if somebody doesn't get a physically, chance to ask someone. So let's start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anilesh Mahajan. I'm a journalist by profession. And I really want to congratulate Suman Sinha for this wonderful book, which he has authored on fossil free. You can buy it on Amazon. It is already available there. Sumant is part of energy sector for last decade, and prior to that, he was handling finances at Aditya Birla Group. Prior to that, he was in New York dealing with emerging economies at Citibank. Sumant has a wonderful career. He started his career from Tata's, and then he pursued his love for finance. And later on, he got into this sector when this sector was at its very nascent stage. And Sumant and my relationship is also, running in parallel for last 1 decade. I'm observing this sector from outside since 2009-10, and he is part of the sector from inside and driving it through. And he's now country's largest player in the renewable sector. Sumant, I welcome you on behalf of Aditya and Ashwini ji at CIU. And I really want to understand from you, what drove you into this energy sector? What excited you in this segment? You were dealing with finance, and you were dealing with, big countries. You were dealing with, big money managers. And this energy sector, as we all understand, is a sector where you have to get your hand dirty. So what excited you there?
Yeah, thank you, Anilesh. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always good to talk to you. And thank you, Ashwini ji, for having me and being agreeing to be the chief guest. And Aditya, thank you as well. And I'd like to thank everybody else also who's come in. Um, so why did I join the energy sector? Anilesh was a question. Actually, I didn't so much join the energy sector as much as I joined the climate change sector. That was really what prompted me to come into this sector. And the reason was that, as you rightly said, I was working in the Aditya Birla Group in 2007, and I was approached by a headhunter. So it's one of those very accidental things, who wondered whether I'd like to come and work in a company called Suzlon, which was at that time a wind turbine, used to make windmills. So I decided that, that's actually what got me started to look at the sector. And when I looked at it, I realized, and this is back in 2007, that climate change was going to become a very important issue going forward. That was the sense that I had when I, looked at it, examined it, studied it, and I realized, of course, that wind energy was one solution to it. And at that time, solar was still tiny, so it wasn't showing up in anybody's radar screen at that time. And so wind energy was one way of solving the energy problem, electricity problem, which was a part of the energy problem, which was contributing to carbon emissions. So I felt that that was a sector that was just taking off, which was the issue of reducing carbon emissions. And I felt that longer term, it would become a very, very important area. And that's why I joined the sector, to be very honest with you, because I felt that climate change would become a much bigger issue for humanity in general. And so it was really more of a directional call that I took on that issue rather than get into the energy sector per se. The energy sector was, in a way, the entry to get into the whole carbon mitigation business. And so that's what I did. I left the Birla Group and I joined Suzlon. I was in Suzlon for a very short while, only a year and a half, because around that time the global financial crisis hit just as I joined Suzlon. And the company ran into all sorts of problems, which I had not anticipated. And after being there for a year and a half, and after having learned the wind energy business from the inside, at that time the Indian government was looking at making some changes and trying to encourage more the development of long-term dedicated companies in the sector, IPPs in other words. independent power producers in the renewable energy sector. And so they were offering some new kinds of incentives to, to develop this new segment of companies. And so I said, I have an understanding of the sector now that I've been there for almost a year and a half. And it's also a very capital intensive sector because you have to ultimately, spend almost $1 million or about 6 to 7 crores for every 1 megawatt that you put up. So you have to get that capital from somewhere. And so in some ways that raising of capital played to my strengths as having been in the finance industry for a long time. So I felt that, look, I understand the sector, I understand how to raise capital. And so therefore the opportunity certainly seems to be there. And so the only thing that in some ways was holding me back from going ahead was taking risk. And so, that's really the first thing that that an entrepreneur has to do. And so I said, you know what, let me go off and take the risk. And that's when I left Suzlon and started this company, Renew Power, which I have now been running for the last 10 years. So that's how I got into the energy sector.
Actually, you have completed almost a decade in this sector. And if we both look at a hindsight, in 2010, land was a big issue. When we talk about the transmission system, that was a big mess country was in. Then, at that time, the technology was also at its very nascent stage, both for wind as well as for solar. Solar was late entrant, but the issues were there, and it was very expensive if we compare it with the grid parity. Then, there were issues related to payment from Discom. Discoms are still it's very bad shape. It still requires some work. It was very, very difficult proposition, and you must have understood this very well, that it would not be easy game, but what motivated you more that, were you confident that over the period of time, these things would be sorted out, or you were pleasantly surprised now that, many of these things are being resolved? So what was your thought in 2010?
Analesh, when you take some of these decisions, you have to take them without overthinking the issues. If I thought about all the issues that you mentioned, and all the problems about doing business in India, particularly in infrastructure business, and if I had really been fully aware of all the problems, then if I was a rational person, I probably would not have gone into the sector. Because all the problems that you mentioned are very relevant, very real, very difficult to deal with. But because I didn't understand them as deeply as I should have, I just took the view, theek hai, hoga, ab sort out kar lenge. Okay, and that attitude is what really I thought that whatever problem comes up, we'll solve it. So, and partly we've been able to do that. Of course, some problems you just can't solve sometimes, but you try to work around them. And you have to use basic common sense to solve a lot of the issues. The thing I did not realize, or the second thing I did not realize, one was, of course, the difficulty of executing projects on the ground in India. The second thing I did not realize at that time was while I was taking a directional call on climate change becoming more important and a bigger issue going forward, I had no understanding as to how big an issue it will become and how much technology will evolve and how cheap renewable energy would become and how it would not just be a climate change issue, but a commercial reason also, which would then become the big driver for our industry going forward. So these are things that I could not have anticipated at that point in time. And that's why when a few days ago, somebody asked me, what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur? I said, look, a lot of it depends on luck and a lot of it depends on your risk-taking ability. Because at the time that you take a decision to do something, you can't anticipate how the future will turn out. It may not turn out well, in which case too bad for you. But sometimes it also turns out very well and your sector ends up being a very high growth sector. And then it becomes much easier to grow your business. Fortunately, that's what happened in our sector. It ended up being a very heavily growing sector. And in our case, what really helped us is that in 2014, when the NDA government came in, the Prime Minister took personal interest in the sector. And that really, I think, had that not happened, frankly speaking, I think the rest of the government would have perhaps not had the street, the emphasis, the focus, the target, and so on. But because it came directly from the prime minister, and because you're such, so strongly committed to, new technology and new issues, I think it became like a article of faith for everybody in the government that this is something that we have to do, whether we like it or not. And so that really helped, because that really what that did is it made India a very early adopter of these technologies in a very big way, and has now got us to a very good amount of scale, so that we can now, from this platform that we've now got to, we can look at going much, much further now than we might have otherwise been able to do had it not been such an article of faith in this government. So I think in that sense, we were very fortunate also. And again, I could never have anticipated that, in 2010 when I started, what would happen in 2014, who would become the prime minister, that the prime minister would be such a strong supporter. Those are things that ultimately, that's why I say luck has to go in your favor as well.
In fact, most of your peers at that time, who were venturing into this segment, they all might have gone bankrupt, if you name Mozabir or Indosolar or many others, and only few of you survived. Was there any mantra, which you had, which others also should learn, especially if somebody is getting into a newer sector, entrepreneur, he should keep in mind while getting into a flourishing sector or newer sector, which might have a brighter prospect in the later years. So can you give a mantra which you might have followed?
That's a very interesting question. And I have asked myself that question many times also. That if there were 20 or 30 companies that started off 10 years ago or 8 years ago, why is it that only a few of them have survived? I think the reason for that is, and it's nothing very dramatic, unfortunately. I wish I could give you some real cool mantra and say, this is what it is, and then everybody could follow it. I think the issue is that a lot of it depends on very commonsensical execution. You just have to be, very rational. If you come with very strong opinions that are not based on fact, you'll end up taking wrong strategic decisions. And then you'll end up making mistakes with the capital that you're investing, and you'll not be able to grow the business as you should. So just be very fact-based, be very objective, don't be opinionated, be very commonsensical, listen to people around you. I think that's very important. And execute well over time. I think if you execute well consistently, then that is what separates you from other people who at some point will end up making a mistake. I'm sure that we'll also end up making a mistake at some point. The only hope is that we'll get to a size and scale that when we make a mistake, maybe it's not a big enough mistake that it'll sink us, it'll just impact us in a small way. But I think that's really what is very important. You have to just execute consistently over a long period of time and avoid making big fundamental mistakes, which can happen if you get too opinionated, too arrogant about yourself, if you start thinking, I know everything there is to know. And if you may start making those mistakes about yourself, then you can come to grief very quickly. So you have to be very humble, and you have to have a very open mind.
I'm tracking you almost from your beginning of this sector and many of your peers as well. And I have an observation, and you missed 2 points into this. One is that you always was conservative, and you were taking baby steps. You never, went, even when, Prime Minister was excited, even when Piyush Goyal was excited, you decided to take, I think, baby steps that, I will not go overboard. I will not take huge risks. I saw, and in fact, we also conversed on this issue that why don't you get aggressive in your bids when reverse bidding thing happened? You always took baby steps. Was it a conscious decision that you were taking that I will have to be conservative and, baby steps, and then only build up?
Yeah, no, absolutely it was. One of the things that we did, as you observed, we are now one of the largest companies in our sector. And the reason we became one of the largest is not because we were the most aggressive company. We were actually the most conservative company. And we were very conservative in our capital strategies and how much capital we raised, when we raised it. We were conservative in bidding for new projects, as you observed. And because we were conservative, therefore we were able to give new investors the comfort that we were able to execute well. And because we were able to therefore raise more capital, that therefore allowed us to keep growing at a reasonable pace. Had we, I think, taken on too many very significant aggressive steps, there's a good chance that they don't work out. And if they don't work out, then you can actually bet in the company, which you don't want to do. And I think because we had that kind of DNA, I think that's one of the reasons why investors trusted us to be good stewards of their money. And ultimately, what is our job? Our job is to raise money from other people, invest it. It's not like I come from a background where I have a lot of money or anything. So our job all the time was to raise capital and invest that capital. And to invest that capital, deliver returns on a committed basis to our shareholders, who would then be happy to give us more capital. And so that's really been, I think, one of the important factors, that we've been able to deliver what we had promised, not take any big steps that, where if a mistake might have sunk us, and where we've raised capital ahead of time.
Yeah, Suman, but I would disagree that you were coming from a family where the money was a issue. Your dad handled country's money, and your brother later on handled country's money, and I'm sure
No,
you
but
are good.
handling other people's money is one thing. I'm just saying that it wasn't my money. Yeah,
Let me complete my sentence. And you are good enough and capable enough to handle your investors' money.
true.
And that comes in with the DNA. And you are one of the successful guys who have been able to raise equity capital. And now, when we look back, at that moment, I was thinking that, Sumant is probably getting more excited in, selling his equities. And probably when, this sector is increasing, and probably he should hold on to his portion and make more money later. Uh, Maybe at that time, debt was an issue, and you wanted to be conservative, and it doesn't want to take those type of risks.
No, but Anilesh, I'll tell you one thing.
Hmm.
I haven't sold a single share of mine in the company so far after 10 years. Okay.
Okay.
The reason my equity ownership is small is because we've consistently raised new capital
Hmm.
with a view to growing the company.
Hmm.
Now, one of the mistakes a lot of Indian entrepreneurs make is that they decide that control is very important for them.
Hmm.
And therefore, they don't like to raise capital to support the growth of the company when it is required.
Hmm.
And that leads to problems, because then you end up doing things that are not good for the company. It may be good for you personally, but it's not good for the company.
Hmm.
And the view I took very early on was that, number one, I'm different from my company.
Hmm.
I have to do what is good for the company as the CEO of the company, number one. And number two, that if I do what is right for the company, then longer term, I may have a smaller share in the company's equity, but the equity value of the company itself will grow to a point that on an absolute basis, I'll end up hopefully creating more wealth for myself in the longer run, or more value for myself. But as a result of the fact that this is a capital intensive sector and we've raised a lot of capital over time to fund the growth, therefore my equity ownership in my business is small. I mean, that's unfortunately the reality of the situation. But, ultimately, and this is a question you ask yourself all the time: how much money do you need? And what do you lead your life for, right? You come very quickly to those questions. And then you realize you really don't need that much money, right? As long as you can have a comfortable enough existence, then there are other things that are more important. At least they are more important for me. For a lot of other people, they may not be more important. But what is more important for me is to build an institution that lasts the test of time, that I can look back later on and point to with pride and say, this is a great institution that we've created, and that has been involved in some degree of, in some measure in nation building, that we've contributed to society at large. I think those personally for me are more important issues than just a focus on just, either having a certain percentage or having a certain value creation and so on. Because then the thing is, you realize these things as you grow older, I guess, which is what I've done over time. And so then you start becoming a little bit more philosophical about these things, and start realizing what is truly important and what is not.
I really hope you don't turn up into a monk in the next decade. But this is very interesting time in the history of fossil fuels. When most of the Middle East countries, they are not been able to raise the prices of fossil fuels. Then there are issues related to the climate change. But now with the return of Joe Biden, and he's already talking about it, that US will join back the Paris Accord. Other than optics, I wanted to understand from you on these two aspects. What does this mean, if America gets back into the Paris Accord? What does this mean to the world, and what does this mean to renewable energy companies like you? Secondly, with the price of fossil fuel not jacking up or staying sub 50 or sub 60, do you think that vulnerable Middle East would be, an energy security threat for the world? What is your thought process?
Sure. So, Anilesh, before I answer your question, I'll give you a little bit of background about climate change and where we are on that whole journey to combat climate change, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's important to have that understanding of the urgency of the situation. So, the UN IPCC, which, IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Coordination for Climate Change, which is sort of the definitive body that studies the science behind climate change and then comes out with recommendations to the world at large about what is possible, what is scientifically happening, and so on. Now, there is a clear-cut consensus that has developed globally, partly driven by the IPCC, that we cannot afford to have more than a 2 degrees centigrade temperature change happening in the world before it leads to catastrophic climate change events, whether they are cyclones, whether of devastating nature, whether they are floods, whether they are droughts, whether they are rising seawater levels and therefore the impact on coastal areas, and so on. So, I think we cannot, therefore, if we are to take that feedback on board, and there is a lot of deep science behind it as well. And unlike Trump, at least I don't deny the science. The point is that we cannot afford to have more than a 2 degrees centigrade temperature change. Now, where are we on that? The second general consensus is that once the amount of carbon in the atmosphere crosses about 700 to 750 gigatons, then at that point we'll start looking at more than 2 degrees centigrade temperature change happening. And the reality is that in the last 50 to 70 years, 1 degree centigrade temperature change has already happened. And this is measurable. And if you look at the graphs, it's actually quite unbelievable how in the last 30, 40 years, temperature has just gone up and up and up. So we cannot afford to have more than 700 and 750 gigatons into the atmosphere of carbon. Today, we already have about 600 gigatons in the atmosphere, okay, which has been emitted by all the developed countries mostly so far in the history of humanity, which means we have only about 100 to 150 gigatons more that we can emit before we cross the 2 degrees centigrade climate change. And these are very hard things to reverse because it takes a long time to create the damage. And then it's almost, unless you can actually suck the atmosphere out, suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, it's almost impossible to reverse it. The question is therefore, at what pace are we going right now? How much carbon are we emitting every year as a globe? And how much therefore will this 150 gigatons take for us? Now, today we are emitting about 10 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, which means that in a scant 10 to 15 years, we would have crossed the carbon budget. And so therefore, the time to act, if you believe all these numbers, the time to act is almost behind us. We just don't have enough time, right? And the reality is that irrespective of how quickly we dial back carbon emissions, that 10 gigatons number, which is growing at a certain percentage every year, will keep going up for some time before it reverses and starts coming down, but we'll still keep putting carbon into the atmosphere. And so therefore, it is very, very urgent. That is why people call climate change an emergency, because it is really, really an urgent problem for us. And therefore, to my mind, the fact that Trump, when he came in, he denied the science behind climate change, he refused to acknowledge it, and he therefore pulled the US out of the climate accord, was the most grievous damage that could have been done to the climate change battle. And the reason is that before he came in, Obama and John Kerry had been instrumental in, along with all the other countries of the world, including India, in coming up with the Paris Climate Accord, which, by the way, by itself was not sufficient. The Paris Climate Accord was only putting us on a path to get to 3.5 degrees centigrade temperature change. So it wasn't even enough by itself, because it was based on voluntary commitments by countries. And even those voluntary commitments, Trump pulled out of. And so not only did we lose the leadership of the US in climate change conversations, but we also lost the fact that the US government, or the US economy, which accounts for, out of this 10 gigatons, accounts for about 1.5 gigatons, said, I'm no longer a party to this. So it made the whole accord a lot weaker. So the good news with Biden's winning is the fact that now that he's coming in, he said that as soon as he becomes president, he'll come back into the Paris Climate Accord. And we need that, because with the 1.5 gigatons every year of carbon emissions from the US, we need that economy to fundamentally be making sure that they do whatever they can to dial it down. And they have to also provide capital, and they have to provide technology to the rest of the world, because they're the guys who have polluted the most. So they are the guys who also have to pick up the biggest tab. So it's important for the rest of the world that the US comes back to the table, starts doing its bit on climate change mitigation issues. And therefore, I'm glad that Biden is a big believer in these issues, and therefore hopefully will come back and restart the whole climate change conversation. So I think it's very, very important that he's coming back. The second question you asked about what happens to the Middle East with oil prices at below $50, $60. Obviously, all those states are going to start running fiscal deficits, because they all, they typically tend to have assumed a higher price. I think it will lead to some degree of instability politically in the Middle East. And if we continue to go forward and there's a bigger shift towards electric vehicles, that will happen, then these economies will lose the ability to sell their primary product, and oil prices will come down. And therefore, these countries will become even more unstable as we go forward. And see what's happened to Venezuela. It's descended into chaos for, of course, many other reasons as well. But it's lost all its oil revenues because they're not able to pump oil any longer, and nobody's buying that oil from them. And even on Iran, when the US put sanctions, it really hurt the Iranian economy when they couldn't sell their petrol as much as they wanted to. So as oil revenues start going down, I think there is going to be a big rebalancing of geopolitical interest away from the Middle East, because suddenly these economies, these countries will lose their economic heft. They'll lose their petrodollars that they have access to today. They'll become much less relevant in the global context. And I think the focus of all countries is based on self-interest. And so the US, the Western world, even countries like India, will start developing our own access to energy resources, whether it's through electricity, replacing oil demand and so on. I think all of that will happen. So unless these countries find a way to quickly pivot towards these new technologies, they will have a problem in the future. And even if they pivot, they won't have the massive natural advantage that they'd enjoyed on just pumping oil out of the ground. And I think this is where countries like India, which have always been deficit in oil, will really stand to benefit and can really take the lead on becoming leaders in this new emerging global economy, which is not going to be based on oil. Of course, all of this will not happen in 5-10 years. This will play out over the next 30 to 50 years, right? And it will happen in a slow way. But really, the time to prepare and position is now. So I think, the Indian government is doing absolutely the right thing by pushing for Atmanirbharta in manufacturing in this area, and by making sure that we develop a robust industry in this, sunrise industry of the future.
My next question was obviously on this, other than the Trumpism hit, world has also got a hit of this pandemic. And pandemic is also changing two things. One is on the global economic order, that, China may no longer be the global factory for manufacturing many of the products which solar as well as wind, plants require. That would create some bit of problem for many of players like Renew Energy. So how are you preparing for, these type of challenges? And they are talking about that now we want to push tariff as well as non-tariff barriers to block many of these things. And these new capacities, it will take some time to come up, and B, they would still be requiring, the raw material from China, uh, so that, like polysilicon and ingots and other things. So how do you see, this space? And secondly, when we talk about electric vehicles, again, we would be dependent on China, because most of the things which are required, like lithium ion batteries and other type of energy sources, I'm sure Bharat is there and he is very excited about hydrogen. But maybe later on we can bring that as back aspect as well. But how do you see, this space? Can we actually block, our trade, or reduce our trade with China, and then still be Atmanirbhar, at least in the renewable space?
Analesh, let me say that we don't have a choice in the matter. If you just look at the next 10 years, we will be investing, or we will be requiring to invest only in solar panels, not the whole solar plant, only in the solar equipment, solar panels, at least $100 billion. Okay, so every year we'll have to invest almost $10 billion. Now, to my mind, it makes no sense for us to be importing $10 billion of solar modules from China every year, for them to build up their industry, and for us to just increase our fiscal deficit. Our trade deficit. Our trade deficit to China today is already $50 billion, right? And another $10 billion on top of that makes no sense at all. So therefore, we have to, without a choice, invest in setting up domestic manufacturing. And therefore, yes, I agree with you that there will be a period of transition when we migrate from Chinese to India. And during that transition period, a lot of capacities for IPP have been auctioned, and those will have to be protected in some way, because those are all auctioned based on assuming imports from China. And it will also take at least 2 years for this domestic manufacturing industry to be set up. So I think for 2 years, we need to plan for a transition period. But after that, through tariff and non-tariff barriers, the Indian government must make it absolutely clear that we will no longer import modules from China. And I think we can easily do that. There is no problem. I am pretty convinced that we can set up capacities. Maybe initially they'll be 15 to 20% more expensive than Chinese capacities. But over time, as the Indian industry matures and evolves, I'm pretty sure that we can get the delta down to a smaller level. Keep also in mind that solar has become so cheap now, right? It's so much cheaper than coal-based power. It's half the cost of coal-based power, that even if you increase the price by a little bit, it's still much cheaper than anything else. So I think, there is no reason for us to not have just a little slightly more expensive solar power to develop the domestic industry and reduce reliance on all other countries of the world. I think that is absolutely critical. We as a company are also therefore thinking that as this is all going to play out, how do we manage ourselves? Because there will be some disruption for some time, and so therefore we are thinking also of investing in manufacturing, because ultimately I feel that this is a sector that is going to grow quite substantially going forward. And in the rest of the world, either you're an IPP company or you're a manufacturing company. There are very few companies that do both. But I think in India, we'll develop our own unique models. And why not? After all, India is a big enough market that we can develop our own business models as well. So if in India you have companies that do both manufacturing and IPP, that maybe is unique to India, and it is relevant for India to have those kinds of companies. So I think you'll see some IPPs getting into manufacturing. You'll see a lot of only dedicated manufacturing companies and only dedicated IPPs as well, of course. Now to your question about, we'll still have to import components from China. In the beginning, you're right, we will have to. But the good thing is that if you look at the cost of a solar module, which is, let's say, approximately 20 cents a watt, okay, of that, the cost of cells and modules is about 15 cents. The cost of wafers and polysilicon is only 5 cents. So if we can first start with cells and modules, then already 75% of the manufacturing value chain will be, and value addition will already be sitting in India. Yes, we have to over time even look at that 25%, which is the 5 cent cost of polysilicon and wafer as well. And therefore, we do need to have companies that invest in that part of the value chain also. Now, inherently, that part of the value chain requires much larger scale because, and it requires much more power intensity and therefore also more capital. So the question is, what sorts of companies can invest in that? It's harder for companies like us to do it because, those are very large size investments. But this is where, again, the Indian government is thinking, I think, a little bit out of the box. Companies like Coal India, for example, if coal is going to really come down dramatically over time, then the free cash flows of Coal India, instead of going into new coal mines, can actually go into setting up, for example, a large polysilicon factory, ingot manufacturing factory, and so on. And it can then become the supplier to all the downstream cell and module manufacturing companies. So I think, and ingot and polysilicon requires investments of maybe $1 or $2 billion at a time, which larger companies like Coal India will have no problem doing. So that's one possibility. I'm not saying that's the only possibility, but that's one of the possibilities. The second thing is, you can actually get the global polysilicon guys to come and set up shop in India by at some point eventually putting some tariff barriers around the polysilicon part as well. But not in the beginning. I think it's once the whole cell and module industry is developed, I think that's when you should, as the next logical step, think about doing that. So I think it's that's the way I would go about doing it. Once the cell and module industry develops, then glass, backsheet, other things that go into manufacturing a solar module will all automatically start getting set up domestically. Now the question is, what about the battery side? What about lithium ion itself or lithium itself? And what about some of the other things that are required? So there, look, fortunately, the reliance is not just on China in that part of the value chain. The reliance is on many other countries as well. So, I would be less fast about the battery side of it because there, at least as far as the raw material is concerned, we have many other countries that supply it as well. Certainly, as a country, we should, just like we have ONGC Videsh going and acquiring oil assets, we should perhaps retask ONGC Videsh to go and also acquire lithium assets or other rare earths that go into the manufacturing of batteries. And I think that's, again, the government can potentially think about doing that and making those kinds of investments. You talked about electric vehicles as well. Now, electric vehicles, I think, is an area where we need to move fast. And just like we mandated a target of 450 gigawatts now for 2030 for renewable energy, I think similarly, we should mandate a target and say by 2030, at least 50% of all new vehicles sold should be electric vehicles. Because if we don't have that kind of mandate, our industries by themselves will never move because they will require to make more investments. It'll be an unfamiliar area for them. They may not have the right technology. They may get outcompeted by some foreign companies coming in. So by themselves, they will never do it. But one thing I know about Indian corporate sector is that if you push them, then they respond very well, right? But if you don't push them, then they will not respond. So therefore, I think to some extent, the government has to take enlightened leadership here and come out with a mandate and say, this is how much you need to do. And once that comes out, it's only then that you'll start seeing a lot of the Indian two-wheeler, three-wheeler manufacturers, automobile, the four-wheeler guys, the public transportation manufacturing companies like buses and trucks, all of them will then only start moving. And to give an example, the UK a few days ago came out of the mandate where they said that post 2030, all electric vehicles sold in the UK, all vehicles sold in the UK should be electric vehicles. Now, once you make that kind of announcement, it creates a market, makes the market size visible, and then people can comfortably then start investing behind that because now they know the market is going to be there. And the government is absolutely committed to going in that direction. That's when you really start seeing investments begin to flow. So I think that is something that the government should consider doing.
The problem with Indian manufacturing structure is this, that 50% of our manufacturing is automobiles. And, if we look at the conventional ICE and ECE engines, they have 10,000 odd, moving parts. So most of them are manufactured in India. And if we compare it with, electric vehicles, they are roughly around 72. So you can see that, this can actually disrupt the manufacturing side. So India need to move the entire manufacturing ambit if they need to put in electric vehicle like many of the countries. That also create wealth for us, but also give employment to many of our fellow countrymen. So that makes the equation more complex that, whether we should get into this or we should go slow, or we should get into hybrid model, and what sort of things need to be done. But when I was going through your book, I also read a chapter on smart grids. That is also very interesting experiment which India is going through, especially when our distribution companies are into a mess. Do you think that they can move faster on this, and they have this bandwidth, and make these grids smarter so that they can cut down on their losses, especially on the AT&C losses? What is your thought process on this?
Yeah. Yeah, Anilesh, actually, if I were to just take another step back, which I'm doing a bit of right now, but if I take a step back, energy accounts for 3/4 of carbon emissions. And within that, electricity accounts for 1/4 of carbon emissions. Now, we know that there is hope in the electricity sector that we can move to clean electricity, right? That hope is now emerged because of renewable energy. Of course, it will take many decades to play out because we have legacy systems, we have many people who have jobs in the sector, we have investments that have been made. So it won't happen easily, but over a 3-4 decade period, I'm sure it will happen that a large part of our electricity sector moves towards renewables and becomes clean. So 1/4 of our energy consumption will become clean over time. The question is, what about the balanced 3/4? Or in the case of energy, the balance 50% out of the 75%. So one of the very important things is that we have to electrify more and more sectors of our economy. And obviously, automobiles is a very clear example of that. It's an important part of mobility. It's not the only part of mobility because aviation and marine are the other two parts of mobility, which are not looking like there's a good solution for those. But electric vehicles, therefore, we have to move rapidly and electrify as well. And like that, there are many hard to abate sectors like steel and cement where a lot of energy is used, which also we have to move towards electricity. And so we have to increase this 25% of electricity out of 75% of energy and make it a much bigger number, and then clean the electricity as we go forward as well. So that is one thing. Now, in terms of your question about, and why was I talking about this, is because then as electricity becomes a bigger part of energy, obviously electricity is carried through wires. And this is where the whole transmission system and the whole distribution system becomes so fundamentally critical, because we cannot grow that 25%. First of all, we can't even have green that 25%, because as we know, renewable energy is intermittent in nature. So grid management becomes a constraining factor for the growth of renewables within the overall electricity mix. But then we can't grow the 25% of electricity out of 75 either if we can't manage the grid well. So the grid will become a fundamental stumbling block. Now, there are two aspects to the grid, actually three aspects. One is the grid management itself, and the second is the distribution part of it. So I'll deal with the two separately. In the grid management, there are two parts. One is the physical build out of the grid. Is there enough grid to carry energy from one part of the country to another part? Is it physically there? And the second part is the software that is required to do all of this demand management and match the supply and the demand, especially in the context of people having rooftop solutions, more consumption going into many different parts of India, going from very large single thermal plants to many small wind and solar plants. So both the generation side and the demand side is going to get much more disaggregated over time. We need tremendous software upgradation to manage this injection and taking out of power. That is something that really needs to be improved. The physical build out of the grid is happening, but the softer aspects of the grid in terms of its management is something where we need much more institutional capability, expertise, and knowledge. And that is just not there right now, partly because management of the grid sits in the state's hands. And unfortunately, one of the things that has evolved is a very big gap of expertise and thinking between state levels and central level. The center is totally on board with what needs to be done and which is the direction to move in. But the states, for all of their own reasons, are not on that same boat. And that gets us to the other problem of distribution companies. Exactly the same thing is playing out there as well, where the central government absolutely realizes that distribution companies are becoming the single biggest constraining factor to all of these big ambitions that we have. And the state governments, for their own reasons, are not willing to go forward and really rationalize and change the quality of the distribution companies. And therefore, all the distribution companies are in poor financial health. They have very high AT&C losses, which they're not able to get control of. It's come down substantially under the pressure of the central government, but it is still very high. And there is no investment happening in improving the quality of the wires that go to people's homes or the knowledge of how people are consuming power. That is just not happening. And the quality of the regulatory framework that exists at the state level is also very poor, unfortunately. And so all of these issues are known to the central government. They are trying to work on finding solutions to this. But ultimately, because power, as you all know, is a concurrent subject, it is moving at a bit of a differential pace. And this is, to my mind, the single biggest risk that we have in this big thing that we are trying to do of reforming the electricity sector and making it clean and growing it as part of the part of the energy basket. And the government is trying various things. They are incentivizing through capital, lending to these companies. And eventually, I think the solution will have to be some form of privatization and just take the DISCOMs out of the hands of the state governments and out of the hands of politicians at the state level. Because as long as it sits there, politicians for their own vested interests will never let go, unfortunately, and will never run these entities properly and will never really work towards their financial health. And therefore, investments will never happen. And the central government, I think, recognizing that, has now decided to privatize at least the union territory distribution companies. And maybe over time that becomes a model. And then we'll see how that goes. And maybe that then becomes a way for state governments also to see what is possible, what is not possible.
But do you think that, these farmer protests in Punjab, that might have impacted the electricity sector reforms as well? Because many of the aspects in this, electricity reforms, which would have cleaned up distribution sector, central government was taking over many of the things from the state, like setting up of regulators and, giving direct benefits to the farmers. Do you think that because of mishandling or whatever is the situation, the electricity sector has taken a bit of a hitting?
I would hope not, Anilesh, and I would hope that the issues are separate from each other. And in some ways, that may be the case because, as you know, almost maybe a year ago, or maybe 6 months, I can't remember the exact time, the central government introduced amendments to the Electricity Act, which were very far-reaching in scope and changes that were being proposed. There was the intent of creating a separate dispute resolution authority. There was the intent of making the regulators, appointment of regulators at the state level more independent of the states themselves. So those were two of the very fundamental changes that the central government is trying to impose to take some degree of power away from the state governments. And I don't know the exact outcome of the conversations that have been had between the state government and the central government, but I understand that from the Ministry of Power that they have reached some form of a way forward, which may not be exactly what may have been proposed in the Electricity Act, but are still, I think, a significant step forward from the past. Now, I'm hopeful that that will get passed, and that I'm hopeful that they would have got the states more on board on the Electricity Act changes, and therefore I'm hopeful that it will get passed. But frankly, Anilesh, I'm not obviously into the whole situation at a policy-making level that I can give you an exact answer. And frankly, I also can't relate it to the farmers' protests that are happening because those are two very unrelated things. And I am not sort of deep enough into the agitation that is going on to be able to
farmers protest because there are issues related to federal structure also there.
Sure.
So that is the reason I was making a comparison. But fair point. I'm taking this on. Secondly, and lastly, in fact, we'll have to wind up because many of we are losing time. In last question, there were issues related to contracts, in many of the states, that once the projects were ready, they were again coming up for renegotiations. And what is your experience now? Is situation improving? And the second question, which is separate, because I already have made commitment that this is the last thing. You have given this title fossil free. Do you think this is a reality which we can see in our lifetime, that world can be fossil free? If I go by OPEC's projection, 2040 is the time they are saying that oil production will get peaked to. And India is very aggressive and giving commercial mining contracts to the coal companies. And there are other countries as well. Poland is also looking at these options. US itself was looking at these options before Joe Biden came in. So these are the two questions. One is a smaller one on the contracts, and second, if you
Yeah.
can give us the bigger
Yeah.
builder.
So, on the contracts, look, state governments will always try to do some hanky-panky with the contracts. The reason is that, at the time they sign the PPAs, they sign up to buy power at a certain tariff for the next 25 years. And it is inevitable, given the evolution of technology, that prices will go down. And so every time there is a change of state government, or there is a change of some bureaucrat at the state level, they look at the old tariffs and say, oh, why am I paying such high tariffs for older projects, when for newer projects I'm going to be paying such lower tariffs? So there'll always be the attempt to try to renegotiate. We've had that in the past, and I'm sure it'll happen in the future. So at some level, I blame the states for not respecting the sanctity of contracts. But to be very honest with you, and just between the four walls of this virtual conversation that we're having, I really blame more our judicial system. Okay, and the reason is that the judicial system moves so slowly, if it moves at all. If it moved fast, we could easily go to the courts and get resolutions in our favor. And then, there'd be so much legal precedence that would get set up that nobody would think about questioning contracts in the future. The problem is our judicial system moves so slowly that, you just end up getting stuck. For example, as you know, our case in AP, it's been pending in front of the High Court for the last 9 months, and they're just not hearing the case. What can you do about it? And it turns out that in our judicial system, there is nothing you can do about it. Okay, you can't go to the Supreme Court, you can't go to there's no recourse. If the High Court does not want to hear the case for whatever reason, too bad for you. Okay. So anyway, so to me, it is not just the states here, but I think this is really where the whole issue of ease of doing business in India really comes in. The fact that we have so many different arms that get off government, that get involved, that sometimes you have these problems. So that's my view on the contractual sanctity issue. I wish that nobody would actually question these kinds of issues. They will get questioned inevitably, but if we had a faster way of getting recourse, the problem would have got solved faster. But anyway, we have to operate within the system, and therefore we have to operate. But let me just tell you one thing, that just the AP issue is depressing valuations in our sector by 20 to 25%.
Oh man.
Okay, which means that we cannot raise new capital at the right price. We'll have to get it at a much lower valuation. And which means that you have to lose much more equity, or your shareholders say, look, at this level, I don't want to dilute myself. And therefore it blocks up equity raising. So, the consequences of this are very, very severe, because if one state can do this, we all know about AP and what is the political dispensation and why it's happening. But the foreign investor does not realize that. उसको आप कहाँ पे जाके समझाओगे कौन सी पार्टी है, कौन सा CM है, क्या हो रहा है, क्या नहीं हो रहा है. You cannot explain. So what they do is they just extrapolate. They say, oh, it can happen in one state. Tomorrow it can happen in every other state. And therefore, khachak, risk premium goes up, valuation goes down. So it's actually very harmful for the entire governmental program in this area. So it's very negative. Now, the second question you asked was about fossil free, and will we see a fossil free future in our lifetime? Perhaps not in my lifetime, Analesh. I'm somewhat older than you are. I am hopeful that you might be able to see it in your lifetime, perhaps, but certainly in our children's lifetime, it should definitely be visible. And I'll tell you one other thing that gives me a reason for optimism. As part of Reinvest that was happening over the last couple of days, a European scientist presented, he was a policymaker slash scientist from the European Union, some think tank. And he said that in 2015, they forecast that solar prices in the globe would reach 2 cents per unit in 2050. Okay, so in 2015, they made a forecast that it will reach 2 cents by 2050, 35 years later. Okay. In actual fact, technology evolved so rapidly that we reached 2 cents in 2020. Okay. And in India, the equivalent of 2 cents was 2 rupees, you can say, right? And we've reached that also. So I'm telling you one thing, Anilesh, that technology is evolving so rapidly that we are not able to comprehend it. Okay. And that is a particular challenge for policymakers, because when they make a policy 6 months later, 12 months later, something else changes. Okay. So to give you a very simple example, till 1 month ago, I would have said that the best solution for removing the intermittency of power for renewable energy is to have a combination of solar plus wind and storage. But I can tell you that within a year's time, if the cost of wind doesn't go down, the solar and storage by itself will become cheaper. Okay. And so I'll still be putting up my round the clock power bid that I won 6 months ago, because I have 2 years to implement it. But by the time I finish implementing it, some other solution will become cheaper. So, technology is changing very rapidly, and that is really going to force changes in how energy is consumed, and where it's getting generated and how it's coming to people. And so therefore, while I'm saying that it may not happen in our lifetime, let's not rule anything out. It may still happen in the next 20 years, 30 years. Unlikely, but it could happen.
I'm really, really thankful that, you took your time out and, you authored this wonderful document for all of us to read. I go through this sector, very minutely, and it was mind-blowing book, Sumant. I must compliment your efforts. But, you have written it in a very, very simple, language, so that if somebody who is not part of the energy sector, who hasn't gone in detail into the things, he can also understand, many of the aspects. And this is actually a must read, ladies and gentlemen, for everyone who wanted to get a sight into, what is happening in the global economy, especially on the climate change side, and what is happening in the country's energy sector. Suman, maybe, I'm getting a greedy, a small, this thing that, what made you think that you should write a book? Because this is not your forte as such, but you have written it really well. And I have read, several authors' books, but, this is very engaging. And if I could share it, I finished it in one night, reading it, from cover to cover. It's written so well. So what made you write this book?
Well, thank you very much for saying all those very, very kind words, Anilesh. It's very gracious of you to do that. Somebody, in fact, I was reading a book review of my book, and it wasn't a very complimentary review, I must tell you. So it's very good to hear your words. And the reason that it wasn't a complimentary review is because the person said that, oh, there is no criticism of the government. And, he was a big corporate guy, and therefore he didn't want to criticize the government. But when there's nothing to criticize, why should I criticize? I mean, there has to be a reason to be critical. Of course, there are reasons, but look, there are a lot of problems as well. And, we could have been at a very different point in our evolution. So I think the government has done a terrific job to get us to this point. But the reason why I wrote the book is because, Anilesh, we are in the midst of this massive energy transition. Now, while you're living through a transition like this, you don't realize it. You don't realize the magnitude of it, because it happens very rapidly, but at the same time, very slowly, because it happens over years, right? And the changes that happen consistently but incrementally over time add up to a lot. So till 2 years ago, when I started writing this book, at that time, the general perception was that renewable energy is more expensive than thermal power, and it requires subsidies to survive. And that was already beginning to change. And therefore, the future I knew would unfold very differently from the way people were expecting. So I just wanted it to be out there as a way for people to really understand all the dramatic changes taking place in our sector. And again, to give you a very simple data point, today, the total amount of power generation in the world, in the whole world, is 6,000 gigawatts, okay, or 6 million megawatts. India, by the way, accounts for 5% of that total power generation capacity because we have about close to 400 gigawatts of power generating capacity. Now, this number, 600 gigawatts, against that, in renewable energy itself, over the next 30 to 40 years, we are going to add almost 6 to 7 times that capacity. So whatever power generating capacity the world has set up from our history till now, they're going to set up 5 or 6 times that capacity only in renewable energy in the next 30 to 40 years. So that tells you the amount of investment that is going to happen in our sector. And people are not aware of this, and it's going to be a sector that will become much bigger than the oil and gas sector, which occupies so much of our share of thinking right now, and bigger than the power sector. It's going to be as big as both the power sector and the oil and gas sector put together. So I just wanted people to get a sense of that, an understanding of that, and just share those thoughts. And the reason it's written in very simple language, Anlesh, is because I think in very simple terms, it is good to keep life simple. And if you deconstruct everything to very simple issues, then I think that just makes life a lot easier. So it's written in a way for people to understand so that it gets to a broader audience and so that people can really understand the scale and the pace of change that is upon us in this sector. It's a once in a lifetime change, actually.
Correct. In fact, in last 10 years, I have written almost all my articles on renewable energy, criticizing the government. But, we are sitting at the end of November 2020. But if I look back, 10 years back and see things in hindsight, although it is my duty to criticize the government, but we should also appreciate the way they moved along. They innovated models. They allowed corporates to get into this sector. They never pushed PSUs to be the IPPs. They used PSUs to back up as a backup, like SECI and NTPC. They used them to allow, wealth creation amongst the citizens. There could be, some areas where they could have done better, like manufacturing. I still believe they could have done it 5 years back. They should have looked at that sector. There could be some criticism that, we are allowing renewable energy to become cheaper at the cost of installed capacity of thermal power plants, and we should have exhausted coal. But these are, idealistic things. We all understand that coal is in a big mess, and renewable energy was very quick. And 1/3 of our population was not having access to electricity at all, and we required to provide them. We never anticipated that economy would get a downslope like the pandemic has done. So maybe in future, when the demand would pick up, I'm sure renewable would be the way forward. And I really hope that in both of ours lifetime, we could see fossil-free world. And ladies and gentlemen, I really recommend this book, and you must read. Buy this book at Amazon. The link has been shared by Aditya. Aditya, if you can share it again, if somebody who has joined later, they want to look at this. And I was going through that link earlier. So they are offering some discounts as well. So you can avail that. So we, Sumant, have questions from Raman Agarwal. Ramanji, unmute yourself. Raman Agarwal has a background of from NBFCs. He is part of CIU. He leads the financial institution segment for CIU. Ramanji, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Sumanji. I must compliment. Very, very interesting and enlightening for a person who comes from financial sector. I think it was very, very interesting. So I have one quick query, obviously related to the sector which I am associated, and that's automobiles again. One major push and the stumbling block we see in this drive towards EV is this whole issue of the heavy ancillary industry we have. And I think you would agree that automobile sector is one in India, which is a classic example of how fantastically network of ancillaries have been built up and provided opportunities for the MSME segment. Now, with switch to the EVs, with whatever little technology I understand, I think the ancillary industries almost goes for a toss. That's what is made to believe. So I would like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so Raman, thank you so much for that question. Look, I'm not an expert on electric vehicles or the existing ancillary manufacturing industry, so I can only give you a fairly superficial point of view. My view to you would be that if we don't do this change proactively as a country, I'm talking at an aggregate country level, then the change is going to be forced upon us at some point in time. Because see, a lot of our auto components industry is meant for exports. If the global market starts shrinking, what happens to those exports? Even if we protect the domestic market and say that in India, we're not going to move to electric vehicles at all, and we'll continue with our ICE vehicles, right? The export market at some point is going to start shrinking, right? The second thing is, all said and done, we do have a massive problem of pollution and so on in the country, which again, moving to electric vehicles at least solves some part of that problem. So yes, I agree that, it's hard to cost the two, the benefit of health and lack of pollution on the one hand versus the tangible cost to the ancillary industry. But certainly there is at an aggregate country level, there is a payback on that change as well. And here the issue is that, again, as a country, do we try to be part of the change and be in the vanguard of that change? Or should we be a straggler on that change? If you're a straggler, you'll never be able to capture this new emerging industry. You'll just 30, 40, 50 years later, you'll find that you missed the bus on this new industry altogether. So better than that being forced upon us and for us to lose whatever little edge we've got in the auto industry, let's actively move to that side as well. Now, what happens to the ancillary industry? I don't have a good answer to that question, frankly speaking. Maybe they have to get deployed into other areas, maybe into renewable energy, maybe into, into manufacturing batteries or some other kinds of storage systems, So I think you have to look at the net gain on the net gain or loss, which is the gain on the one side versus the loss on the other side. Very often the loss is something that is tangible because people who are losing make a lot of noise. The people who are gaining don't make so much noise. And so very often you miss out on that. So at least at a country level, we have to look at both.
Thank you, Sumant. Now may I request Professor Baltesh Singh Maan? Maan sir?
Yes. Thank you, Sumant. It's a mind-blowing interview. We feel educated. And my jigyasa is that could you share a name of some countries or country which is 100% fossil-free, and how could they achieve if it is yes?
No, so today there is no country that is fossil-free. But, there are various countries now, especially in the European Union, and the European Union itself as a whole has set a target that they should become net zero carbon by 2050. So at least in 30 years, they're promising that they'll become zero emitters of carbon. So at that point, you can say that they are fossil-free. Now, keep in mind that, and so in these countries, for example, electricity is already almost 40-50% is renewable or clean in nature. They already have a very large part of their automobile industry where people are buying electric vehicles. So that is also moving. Some of the industrial areas perhaps are not moving yet. And of course, they're still probably consuming natural gas in some way or oil in some way for heating purposes and so on. So therefore, these countries are still emitting carbon. But the entire European Union as a whole is emitting as much carbon as India is emitting right now. And they've promised to get that number to zero over time, which then gives more space, carbon space to countries like India as we follow our growth path. One thing that is very important to get to becoming fossil-free is that we need to start developing technologies that can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. Because it's almost practically impossible to have everything being zero carbon emissions. You'll have something that is going to emit carbon. So to get to net zero, it means that we need to have carbon technologies that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's, I think, an important piece for which there is not a good solution at this point in time. But I'm again hopeful that over the next 20, 30 years, those technologies will also evolve and will add to this whole net zero thought process. China, by the way, is committed, for whatever it's worth, to also become net zero by 2060. So they are saying that they'll get there 10 years later. And that's important because China today accounts for about 27% of the carbon that gets emitted every year. So it's important for them to become carbon free as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next,
Thank you.
I request Bharat Sarutraji. He's former chief of Asia Pacific for French major Alstom and responsible for setting up electric vehicle factory at Bangalore for Alstom. And he is also part of CIU. He leads our transport and logistics vertical. Bharatji, mic is yours. Please ask the question.
Yeah, hi Sumant. I mean, of course, we meet very often, but really delightful to hear you. Very, very insightful interview from your side, and also compliment to Anilesh for the way you put the questions and you got the whole discussion going. So Sumant, as I think we discussed some point of time, I'm starting to work on the hydrogen economy side, and you mentioned Europe. And the conclusion on the Europe front, as far as carbon neutrality by 2050, is that they can't do without jumping onto the hydrogen economy. I was wondering whether, I haven't read your book, I will surely read it. I was wondering whether you've touched on this space of hydrogen economy, generation of hydrogen and then fuel cells, etc. That's one part. And the second part is that, in India, we've always had a challenge in terms of wheeling power. You spoke a lot about distribution. Like we can have multiple GenCos, generation companies, but when it comes to distribution, it's almost like a monopoly type of a situation. Do you think that we could we could do better with microgrids, at a maybe not a village level, but at a maybe a little bigger than village level, and see if we could consume power where it's generated. So the issue, the constraint we have of wheeling gets somewhat dissipated. And now we, particularly in India, now we have, as you mentioned, 2 rupees per unit of solar energy available. And from there, we could perhaps even generate from bio-waste, we could generate, we are an agriculture country, so from bio-waste to bioenergy, and from there to maybe bio-CNG or something, which could then be utilized in the transport sector, which is my domain. So wanted to just get your thoughts on some of these points that I raised.
Sure,
Thank
sure,
you.
Bharat. No, we meet very often because we are both on the board of IIM Calcutta. So, Bharat is is the head of the audit committee there. So there is a lot of interaction that we have, and we are both, I guess, associated with the institute. No, I think, Bharat, to answer your questions, frankly, I haven't covered a lot about hydrogen and fuel cells in the book. And part of the reason is that I wrote most of the book. I finished writing most of the book back in January of this year, and most of it actually even sometime late last year. And frankly, at that time, hydrogen had not become the buzz that it is now. And especially, I would say in the last 3 to 6 months, I have started hearing much, much more about hydrogen than I used to hear earlier. So therefore, you won't find a lot of mention in the book for sure. But I'll give you my thoughts as they are now. And this is one of the challenges in our industry, that it's evolving so rapidly that, whatever you write or whatever policies you make can go out of date very quickly. But on hydrogen, look, the reality is that hydrogen is going to be, it is now clear, a very, very, very big part of the solution. And the reason it's going to become a very big part, and I'm talking about green hydrogen particularly, hydrogen that is made from renewable energy sources, hydrogen that is made from conventional sources, actually may be a part of the solution, but certainly it's not a good thing because, ultimately then it's going to be emitting carbon at some other point at some other place. So I'm really talking particularly about green hydrogen, where you use renewable energy to make the hydrogen. Now, the reason it's going to become a very big part of the solution is because it can become, through fuel cells and so on, a very important part of the mobility solution, especially not so much in electric vehicles on the road, but certainly in marine and maybe in aviation. So I think that's where it can become a big replacer of, making the whole transportation sector a lot less carbon intensive. So in that role it can play. The second big role that it can play is to replace natural gas, especially piped to people's homes. And I think what you'll see very soon is that the government is going to start putting in place, just like we have a renewable purchase obligation to supply, if you buy, let's say as a DISCOM, if you buy 100 units of electricity, you have to buy at least 10 or 15 units of renewable energy, called the renewable purchase obligation. Similarly, for people who supply piped gas, you may have a renewable hydrogen obligation that gets imposed, right? Because in the beginning, hydrogen is going to be more expensive. Costs will come down as technology keeps evolving over time. And so at the beginning to support, you'll have a renewable hydrogen obligation, and then, or maybe green hydrogen obligation, call it what you will. And then slowly over time, that will get phased away as hydrogen and green hydrogen becomes cheaper than natural gas, which I'm sure will happen, some number of years down the road. So I think therefore hydrogen is going to be a very, very critical part of the solution set. Today it's expensive. So we'll have to wait for European companies to again invest in it, European countries to invest in it, bring the cost of technology down. And once it gets down, then countries like India can become fast adopters of hydrogen as well. So if you're spending your time in hydrogen, that's time very, very well spent, is my view. If you want my feedback. And certainly we as a company are also looking at doing hydrogen pilots, perhaps with people like GAIL or Indian Oil, and just tie up with them and do some of these pilots so we can all learn together in this new and emerging sector. Sorry, what was your second question?
On the microgrids, the issue of wheeling power versus,
So on microgrids, look, I still feel that the cheapest form of power is going to be power that you can generate at scale rather than locally. Now, of course, the issue is if you generate power far away and then transport it, and the cost of transportation and all of those things are there as well. So you have to add that to the delivered cost of power. And against that, could something locally developed, whether it's biomass oriented or something else, or even rooftop solar solutions, would that be cheaper? It probably would be, right? The only thing is you also need to couple storage solutions with that, because those things may not be a base load kind of a solution. And then that's when the cost becomes a little bit higher. Now, over time, we know that those costs will also come down, and therefore generating power at a disaggregated level, at a local level, will become more viable, I think, over time. And as it becomes more viable, then the question of being able to island yourself with your own microgrid, and then having local entrepreneurs develop who can then set up wires to homes or take over the existing wires and do the money collection and the power supply, all of those business models can become feasible. Today it's not feasible because the cost is high, and cost of transportation of renewable energy is all free over long distances. So therefore, for local production to compete with at scale production, it's a little bit harder. But over time, it could very well become cheaper. And so therefore, this whole thing that we keep talking about, that consumers will become prosumers because they'll produce and they'll consume as well. And so I think it may very well happen. Until now, I wasn't a big believer in microgrids, because I always felt that once the main grid gets to somewhere, then that will always be able to provide cheaper power. But I have come to realize that technology is evolving, as I said, so rapidly that all sorts of new solutions may emerge that we cannot conceive of right now. The only thing is the business model, because while the technology solution may be there, who implements that model at the ground level? What kind of policy framework is there to support it? Because once that starts happening, then the DISCOM is going to start losing customers, and they will then start becoming even less profitable. So if all the good customers start going away, then who takes the cost of supplying to poorer quality customers? The DISCOM is subsidizing from better customers to poorer customers right now. But if better customers have the ability of going off the DISCOM grid, then what does the DISCOM do? So either it gets privatized and then prevents that from happening. So we'll have to see. So I think on the distribution side, there is going to be a tremendous amount of churn. And if you just look at the numbers, the distribution side of our business, the total amount of power sold in India is about 1.4 trillion units. The average cost of power sold is, let's say, about 5 rupees. So it's about close to like a $80-90 billion sized industry. That is the revenue. That industry is operating at a profit pool loss of about maybe $7 to $8 billion every year.
Hmm.
So the possibility of turning it around and moving from -7 or 8 to +7 or 8 does exist. So it can be a
Right.
very interesting opportunity, but let's see how it evolves, because there'll be microgrids, good quality customers will do open access and start getting out of the grid. Will there be separation of wire from the content? Will there be multiple distribution licensees, or will the distribution companies just get privatized, lock, stock, and barrel? So that whole thing is not fully clear yet.
Right.
So
Correct.
we have to wait and see how that evolves.
Thank you.
Thanks. Once again, compliment you on an excellent interview.
Thank you. Thank you, Bharat.
Thank you. We have a question from Ms. Smita Purushottam. She is India's former ambassador to Switzerland. Smita ji, you can unmute yourself and ask question, please. Smita ji?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for coming late. I had something to do with my mom, and I seem to have missed some really brilliant talk, but I'll read the book and make up for it. Just wondering whether you've already discussed this issue of R&D investment. I find that Indian industry doesn't invest enough in R&D. Have you tackled that issue in your book, or any comment?
Yeah. No, I have mentioned it. I think the reason we don't have enough R&D investment is because we don't have enough manufacturing, frankly speaking. If we had more manufacturing, those manufacturing companies would have been investing in the R&D to make sure that they stayed current on the new product development, new technologies that were coming in, and so on. But because we don't have manufacturing investments in the renewable energy sector in India, therefore you also don't have manufacturing, you don't have R&D. See, people like us who are the bigger players in the sector, what do? We buy the equipment off the shelf, we go to the ground, we acquire the land, and we get cranes and people on site and set up the project. It's not a high-tech business, right? The high-tech actually goes in the manufacturing of the equipment. And because in India, nobody really is manufacturing the equipment, therefore you don't have people investing in that space. Now, it's a little bit different in wind, because in wind, we have a manufacturing industry, and therefore we do have more R&D happening in wind.
Okay.
Okay. But in solar, we don't have anything happening. Similarly, in batteries and storage, we don't have any R&D happening. And even in hydrogen, I would tell you that in the beginning, we'll just be taking technology that exists overseas. So this is a serious gap in the Indian corporate sector, that in the Indian corporate sector is usually very short-sighted and does not invest enough in R&D. Now, what we have done as a company is that we've actually set up a center of excellence at IIT Delhi. Because we said, look, we don't have the resources, we don't have the faculty, the people to do the research. Now, instead of my going and hiring 10, 20, 30 people and paying an enormous amount of money, IIT Delhi already has all those researchers who are keen and desperate to want to do research in the right areas, but they don't know what are the right areas. They don't know what are the issues that are concerning corporates like us. So therefore, they're going off and researching areas that are not relevant for the industry.
Yeah.
So what we've tried to do is we've tried to bring that together, their expertise and our understanding of what needs to be done. And we've tried to marry that together in the Center of Excellence. And now we've got some degree of research going in certain areas. So we need much, much more of that happening, but we fundamentally need more manufacturing, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita ji. Thank you, Suman. Unfortunately, we have the times for questions this much only. It was really insightful and really great hearing Suman, talking passionately about the sector he loves the most. And I'm sure that, the next decade would belong to making country net carbon free or net, net positive on carbon side, that we have a lesser carbon consumption. I'm sure the next decade belongs to us there. Sumant, I really thank, you spared so much of your time from your your busy schedule. I really am thankful. Now, may I request Dr. Ashwini Mahajan to come in and, give his remarks, and then we can conclude.
Thank you, Anilesh. In fact, I just wanted this interview to continue because in fact, all of us sitting in this room are really getting educated, and and we wanted to know more and more about the book, and obviously about the author, how passionate he is. In fact, mm, it is true that when he entered in this whole business, this this business was in a very nascent stage, and as Sumanji uh, had already said, uh, so what I in fact my view on the whole issue, uh, and what Sumantji has been saying, in fact they I mm, was just thinking about it. They match so much. In fact, we have been talking about these issues. Sumanji has been educating us on various policy matters, uh, and me and you have been getting benefited from his experience. In fact, when Modi ji's government came, uh, the first suggestion which I made to this government was that we should put a full stop on the coal-based power plants. Whatever power plants have been established, now we should put a full stop. And somehow they were in the pipeline, and therefore they continued. And we all know what has happened to them. All NPAs in the banking system, a big part of that has been because of the coal-based power plants for various reasons. Uh, there is a need. In fact, as Sumanji had very clearly mentioned, that the way the climate change has been taking place, and the way the whole world is very much worried about it, and the and whatever small hurdles have been there in the global consensus on this issue, that will also be over by Biden coming in. And uh, now the stage is set. But when we look at the Indian side, we are into a huge mess today in electricity. On the one hand, electricity reforms are on cards, but at the same time, there is so much of resistance. Along with the farmers' agitation, people are really talking about, oh, what will happen? The uh, electricity sector is going to be, mm, captured by the private sector, and how the farmers will live, and this and that. In fact, mm, as Anilesh ji and Suman ji know, that I'm very much afraid of using the word reform, because reforms are always the word reform is always misused, because so far the reforms we talk about, they they are only opening up your markets for the FDI and for foreign goods. That is only considered to be reform. But yes, we need such reforms, as Sumanji had rightly mentioned about the huge transmission and distribution losses which are there, and the way the development has taken place in the first this renewable energy. We understand that there are so many kinds of energy sources. You have solar, you have wind, you have coal based, you have so many others. So we need the infrastructure to cope up with that. And when rooftop solar came, and the smart meters also were introduced, people were wary of whether we will be able to handle that through our grid system or not. But that we have been able to really resolve that issue. But the policy hiccups are there. We generally discuss about those policy problems. Now, with the kind of new developments taking place, the way the energy price is coming down, and the way the global thinking is going on, I think the next whole decade belongs to the renewable energy. And if we can imagine aspire for the fossil free world in the next 30 years, that is not something which is not achievable. We can. And in fact, this book may prove to be a big stepping stone towards that. And on this occasion, I would congratulate Suman Sinha ji for having written such a simple book, as Anilesh ji has rightly mentioned, that in simple language, so that people can understand. The policymakers are also not very great experts. We know they can also understand the issues and the problems involved in the renewable energy field. In the end, I would like to really say that I fully agree with Suman Sinha ji for what he said about how the kind of policy regime we would be requiring. Many issues have been raised in questions also, and by Anilesh ji also, that yes, there are issues moving away from the conventional vehicles to the electrical vehicles. There are issues of transition from one technology to another. There are issues with regard to moving away from the conventional energy to the renewable energy. But that is the only way forward. We need to do it. We had been suggesting the government to impose tariffs right from when Modi ji, started his inning 6.5 years ago. But that suggestion was not accepted. And I think the country had to pay through its nose by import of huge amount of solar equipments. I remember during Atalji's time, there was a policy change under which the tariffs were reduced on the wind generators. And then Swadeshi Jagan Manch intervened in that, because self-sufficiency and what you call Atmanirbharta is very much required in every field, and energy can't be an exception to that. And I think the government has risen to the occasion, and with the passage of time, we need to establish capacity in India. We do have some capacity in the wind energy equipments, but we lack that in solar energy. So as Sumanji had also suggested, we need to invest in wafers technology. We have to invest in the other technologies. And Smitaji's question that are we investing sufficiently in R&D, as this is our passion always, that we need to do more and more R&D. But Sumanji has rightly said that we need to have manufacturing first, then only the R&D will happen. So I hope with such passionate people on the ground working, like Sumant Sinha ji, our goal of Atmanirbharta in renewable energy will definitely be achieved. Thank you, Nilesh, for giving me this opportunity to say a few words about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashwini. Thank you, Sumant. And now for the formal vote of thanks, may I request Aditya Malik. Aditya is co-founder of CIU. Aditya.
Thanks, Anilesh, and thank you, Sumant. As everybody is saying, I'll repeat the same thing again, that I think the way you explained these things for us who are non-techies, who don't understand the field, has been extremely simple for us to understand. Thank you for your time, and wish you all the best with the book and your journey as an entrepreneur. All of us entrepreneurs need success badly, and wish you all the success and all the luck. And thank you, Ashwini ji, and thank you everybody else on the call for your time and for an interesting discussion. And thanks, Anilesh. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you from my side as well, Anilesh, for inviting me for this. Thank you, Ashwini ji, for your generous comments. Thank you, Aditya. Thanks to everybody who came up with their time for attending this session. Thank you all.
They all must buy your book, huh?
Yeah, of course. Of course. Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is actually a wonderful book to read. It's not that you're a friend, that's why I'm saying it. But I'm now worried that, you are competing with me as well. As a good author.
No. Listen, it took me 2 years to write this. Yeah. How can I do